Now, the first thing that we need to understand when we're looking at management accounting is how costs work and the standard cost card. The learning outcomes of this video is for us to be able to define management accounting to start with, and then identify these costs for a product or a service, and then also be able to prepare a standard cost card. We'll start with management accounting. What is management accounting? Management accounting is concerned with providing information to people like you and me so that we can make better decisions and we can be efficient and effective in the way we operate. What information are we talking about? We're talking about things like cost, selling price, your profit, and the number of units made, etc. What we want to understand is how these costs work so that we can be able to charge them to a particular unit and then be able to charge a selling price. So let's take this phone, for example. When you look at this phone, there are certain costs that we can think of. And these are costs like, the speakers and the microphone that we have. We've got things like the screen. We've got things like your processor, though it's hidden. We know it's in there. We've got things like your cameras, plenty of them these days. And then, we can start thinking about wages. We can start thinking about the battery. It's inside, hidden somewhere there. We know it's there. And, maybe covers, just to name a few. But then there are costs that we don't think about to start with. And these can be costs like your factory rent, your electricity, your gas, water charges, wages for the managers, payment to the accountant who needs to be paid as well, sales staff, and other costs that you can also think about. We need to be able to trace these costs so that we can charge it to, in this case, our phone. Now, these costs, we would need to understand the terminology, how we term them so that we are able to put them in our standard cost card. So you will see things like direct costs. Now with direct costs, this is quite simple. The ones we were talking about just now, those we can trace to a particular product. But then the indirect costs that we just talked about can be often hard to link, like your factory rent, your power of machinery. Sometimes you might see this being talked about as overheads. Another way you might see these costs being talked about, they might be talked about as production costs. Again, your direct costs. Your non-production costs, which would be your indirect costs or your overheads. Now, why we want to understand this is we want to be able to trace them. Once we have our direct costs, our indirect costs, we add them together, we get the total cost. Once we know what the total costs are, we can now divide them maybe by the number of units we're selling so that we know how much it costs for the one product. This would go in the standard cost card, and it looks something like this. Standard cost card mainly is just looking at the cost of one product. In our case, it was the one phone. Now, in our standard cost card, it's very simple. You would have your direct materials to start with. You've got your direct labor, direct expenses. Anything that is direct would go there, and that is called the prime cost. Once we've worked that out, we can then start thinking about the overheads. And there are different ways of looking at this, and we'll talk about that in other concept videos. Once we know that, we then look at the profit, a markup maybe, to see how much we want to sell. Now, let's look at an example and maybe put this into context. We go back to our phone example where we had the obvious costs. Now, say you're given information like this. You have information like maybe your speaker and your mic are £50, camera 75, and you're given that list of the cost. You might also be given your wages, £20 an hour, someone who's taking 30 minutes to assemble the phone. You might be given packaging, maybe the box that the phone comes in, £12 per phone. And then you're given these other costs, the overheads. Selling distribution, 12,000. Now notice it says per year, rent and admin per year. Then we're told that over the year, we are only going to sell 3,100 phones. So what we need to make sure is we cover all these costs, including the 12,000 and the 50,000. So when we prepare our standard cost card, what we then look at is we would take our direct materials to go into the standard cost card. So I just added all those direct materials that we knew. They came up to 350. The wages, the person was working £20 an hour and they were working for 30 minutes. So that's £10. Your packaging, it was given as £12 per phone. And then your selling and distribution, 12,000. And then your rent and admin, 50. Now, if we're only going to sell 3,100 phones, we would need to make sure that we recover all these from these 3,100 phones. So we would add them together, get 62,000, and then divide them by 3,100, and that would give us £20 per phone. Now, if we're going to include this in a standard cost card, it would look something like this. So we would have our direct materials, which would be £3.50. We would have our direct labor, which would be £10. And then our direct expense is £12, and that will come to £3.72 for the phone. And then our overheads, we did share them as £20 per phone, so that comes up to £3.92. And then we would charge some ridiculous markup like these phone companies do, of something like £308, and the phone comes to £800. Now that's the standard cost card, and that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to understand our costs, put them in the standard cost card, and then charge a profit and get to a selling price. So that's the main thing that we're trying to do in this video. Now, just to wrap this up, let's go back to the summary. We said we have direct materials, you can trace them to the phone, direct labor, direct expenses, and these are called prime cost. Then your overheads would be those indirect or non-production costs. We add them together, we get the total cost, and then we add our profit markup, and then we would come up with our selling price. Now, this is a very important concept that we need to understand. Now, in the next task, you'll be given information on the standard cost card for a chair, and then you'll be able to calculate and work through these. Make sure you take your time before moving on to the next concept. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you in the next video.